back, everybody. Welcome to our new video. That's a new installment continuing our story of America during the Gilded Age. If you remember well, the last couple of videos that I made dealt with the birth of the American labor movement, or in other words, how the new urban industrial working class, how they met and confronted the challenges of a new era of industrialization and urbanization and everything that came with it and what they did to meet those challenges. And of course, that brought us to the story of the formation of labor unions and the modern labor movement, if you will. But there are other sections of this country that were dealing with their own challenges during a very challenging time in their own way. So now we're going to shift focus and we're going to talk about um, the American farmer. Agriculture still existed. It had undergone a number of changes, but there were still farmers in the South and in the Midwest, and of course, all those that went out west and into the plains because of the Homestead Act. And they were dealing with their own challenges during this period. And what emerged out of those changes and those challenges was what we called the populist movement. Populism became a pretty amazing movement in this country between the 1870s and all the way to the end of the 1890s. So what exactly do we mean by populism? That word gets thrown around a lot, and it really depends on what country you're talking about, what's the context, what period in history you're talking about. Very fluid, changes a lot. I mean, its root meaning means it's rooted in the people. Um, but then when you bring in context and place and historical moment, you get to the intricacy, the complexities of what that term means. Populism, as we knew it in this country in the late 19th century, was in fact a form of agrarian populism. Agrarianism values rural society as superior to that of urban society. It's a reaction to change. It does have reactionary elements, a sort of a desire to go back to the way things used to be, because somehow in the past we lived in a sort of golden age. And of course, a lot of this is coming from rural folks. A lot of this is coming from, the old agricultural sector of the economy that once was dominant, and it's no longer the case. And they kind of want to go back. They feel that they were better off, and many of them were. Particularly rural Americans were better off in that pre-industrial America than they were there. So there are elements of reaction, absolutely. Um, in agrarian thinking, the independent farmer was superior to the wage worker and sees farming as a way of life that could shape the ideal society. I hate to say it, it's kind of going back to Plato or even, the Roman Republic and the idea of, what ideal citizenship was during that period. And then you have this term of populism, right? And that's, rooted in the people. What do we mean by that? And that, like I said, really depends on the context. We'll call it a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by an established elite. If we root ourselves in this time in history, of course, rural Americans feel that they have been left behind and disregarded by the folks in the cities, by the corporations, by the banks, and most of all, by the government. And so this groundswell of frustration that eventually turns to action, anger and political action, that was the root of it. Much of it was, a lot of folks that were having a hard time navigating a changing society and came to the conclusion that they had been left behind, and that those that had plowed ahead to this new industrial America somehow forgot them and disregarded them. And of course, anger would come from that, and angry demands and political action, absolutely. Um, and here's an image to take into consideration. This really illustrates agrarianism as a thinking, placing the farmer at the center of society. It's an interesting argument, you know. You Most of my students want to grow up to be doctors and lawyers and businessmen and all that, but the truth of the matter is, without food, none of that happens. Society, at all times in history are dependent on those that could feed society. And not many of my students, tell me that they want to go major in agriculture. And yet nobody stops to think just how necessary, no matter how advanced and modern or postmodern or what we believe ourselves to be, we have to eat. We have to eat food. Food is always going to be central to the maintenance of society, no matter how modern it believes itself to be. And that was what the populists were saying. That's what they were trying to remind this country. You guys left us behind. You pushed us aside, but you forgot. We feed you all. We are central to society. We talked about this in class. Probably, possibly one of the earliest, changes. It's really going to shake up um, the state of agriculture in this society. Is the introduction of machinery. Machinery is going to replace human labor. Okay, it's going to displace and uproot a lot of people in rural America. They're going to have to find other ways of making a living, and a lot of this is, migrating. Millions are going to migrate to the cities, and this, in a very strange way, alters the face and the function of agriculture in this country. Um, Food doesn't go away. Um, on the contrary, machines help us produce incredible yields, the likes of which we had never seen. And under normal circumstances, this would be seen as a blessing, as a magnificent, accomplishment, and it was. But in itself, it would, because of the peculiar dynamics of a capitalist economy, um, it would come with a host of its own challenges and difficulties as well. Here's a simple graph to kind of explain the dilemma of the American farmer um, going into the late 19th century. Yes, machinery helped produce high yields, but so much so that there was a crisis of overproduction. We came to produce too much food. Oh, but mister, what about all the people that left to the cities? Doesn't matter. The machinery not only replaced them, but outstripped, okay, whatever contribution they would have made in agriculture. Plus, it's not just machinery outproducing human labor, but now you have more people involved in agriculture than you had before. Thank you, Homestead Act, traditional agriculture and ranching. So thanks to mechanization and the increase of production of producers in the market, you have a crisis of overproduction. What happens when you produce too much of something, especially when it outstrips what the demand for that something is? Producers have no choice. They have to drop prices. They have to drop prices to entice consumers. You know, there's no sense in continuing to produce if you can't sell off what you've already have produced. And if what you already have produced is so excessive in amount that you're having a hard time selling it, then producers across the board are going to have to be forced to drop prices. This is just how supply and demand works. But dropping prices is painful, okay? Because that means you're also cutting into your bottom line. Your profit margins are going to begin to erode. And so here's this weird upside down situation. incredible yields, but the more we produce, the less and less profits farmers are earning, precisely because they're producing too much. And there's too many of them, and they're forced to drive prices down to the point that what they produce is practically not profitable whatsoever. And then compounded on top of this is the incredible amount of debt that farmers are in. They went into debt buying this machinery. And now whatever profit they could squeeze out of already low prices, they're handing it over to the banks for the loans that they took out to buy these machines. Loans that were usually involved very high interest rates. And it's not like they had an abundance of banks to choose from. And the harder it is for you to pay your bills, the less willing they are to extend credit to you. And that becomes even harder to hold on. Foreclosures start to become a reality for millions of farmers. Isn't that crazy? You bought machines to increase production, but in the big picture, you contributed to overproduction, falling prices, and now you're not making enough money to pay your debts, and you just may lose your farm. Who in the world expected that to happen? But it happened to millions of farmers. How are they going to navigate and survive these very different set of circumstances, but nonetheless a very difficult um, moment in history for the American farmer? Look at this graph. Explains everything. Up until about the mid 1870s, farmers made a profit. There was good prices, and they received better prices for what they paid for purchases. As machinery starts to enter American farming more and more people start to enter American farming as general, supply begins to outstrip demand. And starting in the 1880s and stretching into the early 20th century, they're not making a profit anymore. Now they're what they call in their their cost, their business costs exceeds what they're actually making, what they're producing. That means they're in debt. That means they're taking out loans. Okay? If they don't have their farms taken away completely, which was what was happening. In every farm that the bank foreclosed on, okay? It consolidated with another family farm that it closed on, and another family farm that it closed on. And little by little, that's how you get to the end of the small family farm and the beginning of huge agribusiness. Who are the villains of the American farmer? Pretty simple. The railroads, the operators of storage facilities, grain elevators, silos, warehouses, and of course the banks. The railroads, farmers claimed, charged them with abusively high freight rates. The grain elevators and the silo operators were no different. We're charging farmers excessively high prices to store their product. And then the banks were, another villain to the American farmer. The banks became less and less willing to extend credit to farmers. And when they did, it was at very high interest rates. And it was always the threat of foreclosure if they didn't pay those already existing debts. These are the three main villains of the story of the American farmer in the late 19th century. Not to mention the existence of very few rail lines and banks and storage facilities in very isolated rural areas of this country made them virtual monopolies, and they acted in that fashion and took advantage of farmers because they were the only show in town quite often. And if you take the story even further, the argument was, well, the American banks are only doing this because the American banks own owe money to banks in Europe, particularly British banks. So the American farmer found themselves. I think this might be a little, bit of an exaggeration, but the American farmer was paying off the debts of the American banks that the American banks had to British banks. It's just an image, it's an argument. But whether farming was in trouble, which you would not have expected it, but it was, yeah, by the 1890s, 27% of farms were mortgaged. That means people had put out mortgages on their land that they probably got off the Homestead Act, in order to pay off their debts. By 1910, 33% of banks were mortgaged. That means a lot of foreclosures happened. So, what did farmers do about it? Well, much what urban workers did about it. They organized. They organized themselves into groups, and maybe that way they could mitigate, if not defeat, a lot of these challenges that they were dealing with. It's very easy to organize in a factory in an urban setting. In a rural setting, it's much more difficult. People are, well, they don't live close to one another. And quite often they live very far from one another. So those are some difficulties there. First organization that we see emerge just after the Civil War that takes up the cause of the American farmer were known as the Grange. Founded in 1867 as the National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry. That's a lot of words there. They promoted cooperation and mutual aid between farmers. Okay? That's what their solution is. Farmers should band together and cooperate with one another instead of compete with one another. Come to each other's mutual aid as a solution to many of these problems farmers were dealing with. The Grange organized cooperative associations. And if you don't know what a cooperative is, it's basically when a number of family farms band together, share resources, share the land to not only share the cost of business, and this helps individual farms, but also benefit from the combined yield of all of those, farms together. They're democratically run, and cooperatives run. It exists till today. So the Grange did promote, cooperatives as a solution. They peaked in 1875 when they had about 860,000 members across the South, Midwest, and Texas. They dabbled in politics, not too much. They were more about, social improvement, providing education, and most of all, improving the economic situation for farmers. But when they did get involved in politics, they successfully lobbied state legislatures and Congress to pass what they called Granger laws. Most of these Granger laws were about the government intervening to lower freight rates. That's basically what the railroads charge to carry your product. And they also lobbied on behalf of free rural mail delivery. Back then, if you lived too far away, they wouldn't deliver the mail to your farm. You had to travel, sometimes a long distance, to the post office to pick up your mail. And they were able to convince the government to go ahead and make the trip to their particular farms if they were receiving mail. Possibly their biggest victory was Munn versus Illinois. Which the Supreme Court listened to in 1877 and ruled that state governments could regulate private industries like the grain elevators that impact the public good. It's a private business, but if your private business could impact the public, either for better or for worse, substantially, then yes, perhaps the state has a right to regulate that business. And for a while, they were able to push down rates. However, it didn't take long, and about 10 years later, in Wabash versus Illinois, the Supreme Court came in and limited a state's ability to regulate interstate commerce, saying, and it's true, that the Constitution only gives that authority to the federal government. And so that overturned Munn versus Illinois. And by then, they were already rapidly in decline. A lot of the folks, a lot of Grangers wanted to move beyond forming cooperatives and promoting mutual aid and in direction of actual political activism. And here's one image that I want you to see. My students always have a really hard time. It's probably the most famous political cartoon having to do with the Grangers. And tell me if you could figure out what it's trying to say. It's titled "The Grange Awakens the Sleepers" from 1873. And the idea is that the Granger as a movement is trying to wake up all these rural Americans to do what? To organize. Get off that track because what's coming is going to crush you. What's coming? Well, of course, one of the enemies of the American farmer, the railroads, with all that bad stuff, consolidation, extortion, bribery, usurpation. And farmers need to organize themselves to meet this challenge before it gets to them. So, like I said, a lot of Grangers became impatient and wanted to move into politics. And as the Grange fades away, it is replaced by a new organization, the Farmers Alliance. I guess built on the ashes of the Grange, although the Grange doesn't completely disappear. But the Farmers Alliance takes a more political, activist approach towards farmers' difficulties and challenges. It was founded as the National Farmers Alliance and Industrial Union. At least that's what it was called in the South among Southern white farmers. It was the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union among black Southern farmers, and the National Farmers Alliance among white and black farmers of the Midwest and Plains. So it had three organizations, if you will, that together formed the overall National Farmers Alliance. Alliance chapters, much like the Grange, formed consumer cooperatives. Uh, Not only farming cooperatives, but also consumer cooperatives, which sold goods to members at wholesale prices. So you would probably identify that with something like a Costco or a BJ's. And yes, they kind of pioneered the idea, but among farmers. You know, if you paid dues, then the cooperative would pull that money together, buy large amounts of supplies at wholesale prices, and then sell it very cheaply to fellow farmers. So that was another development that helped the American farmer. And they also ran cooperatively owned mills where you mill wheat into flour for farmers who economically were not doing that well. They could do it at a low cost. But on the political front, yes, the Farmers Alliance was more political and less social than the Grange. They advocated for government regulation of railroads, establishment of an income tax, abolition of the crop lien system, which, if you remember, landowners and merchants can put a lien on future crops in exchange for credit. And keep this in mind because this is going to be a big topic, the expansion of the money supply. Being a political advocacy group, they actually endorsed and ran candidates for office and had great success in 1890, where the candidates that they endorsed ended up controlling 8 state legislatures, and they had 40 Farmers Alliance endorsed representatives in Congress. So to them, it seemed like they were picking up steam. Remember, all of this is happening simultaneously with all the events of the labor movement. So if in your mind, if you could place them side by side, parallel timelines, if you will, you'd understand, you'd get a more complex idea of, these very interesting years. This is happening and it is inspired. Don't believe, don't think for a moment that the American farmer is not organizing themselves and in part is not inspired by what they see going on in the cities back east. But even the Farmers Alliance feels that lobbying and endorsing candidates just may not be enough, that the two political parties are too entrenched, they're too conservative, they're too beholden to the interest of the Eastern moneyed classes and the banks and industry, so much so that it's foolish to think that they're ever seriously going to take farmers' concerns in mind, and that maybe, just maybe, the only way to do this is by forming a political party of their own, which is exactly what they end up doing. By 1892, springboarding off the unexpected success they had in 1890, they decided to form an alliance. They had already began forming an alliance with the Knights of Labor. They supported the Knights of Labor throughout the Southwest Railroad strike. Um, and as the 1880s give way to the election of 1892, they're going to form probably the most successful third party run this country has ever known. I mean, they were not dumb. They knew that up to that period, third parties had a really hard time winning anything. Okay? The two parties already were very entrenched. The two parties were all already very conservative. Yes, the Democrats were the Democrats at the time were run by Grover Cleveland, who was a Bourbon Democrat, very much in the pockets of the landed interest that still existed in the South. And the Republicans, at the time represented by Benjamin Harrison, no different. They were in the pockets of industry. Um, and here comes this populist party. As you can see by this illustration, even the cartoonist was making a point that it's a patchwork of a lot of interest that some Americans might have considered to be marginal, if not dangerously radical at the time. Yes, you have Old Farmers Alliance folks, which formed the anchor of this new party. Absolutely. The cartoonist is claiming, there's Knights of Labor in here, there's old greenbackers, yes, even Communist Prohibition Party, Free Silver Socialist, the old Granger Party, all these old pro-labor, pro-farmer, um, even radical groups have come together with common cause to take on the powerful moneyed interest of the East. Um, and so let's talk about these two folks that are probably the most standout folks in the short history of this populist party. James Weaver. James Weaver was a lifelong, well, he was a Civil War veteran officer, lifelong advocate for farmers and laborers and for racial inclusion. Former Republican who served as representative for Iowa in 1879, 1881, when he switched over to the Greenbacker Party. He advocated for the expansion of the money supply and opening up Indian territory to settlers. Once again, well, the Greenback Party ran him for president in 1880, which he did horribly bad, like third parties always tended to. He returned to the House of Representatives in 1885 as the only Greenbacker there. But in 1892, with this alliance forming, he actually helped organize the People's Party, and in return was their candidate for the 1892 election for President of the United States. And then the other person here on our slide, Mary Elizabeth Lease, lecturer, writer, attorney, political activist, outspoken American woman, very much involved in political life despite not having the right to vote. Populists loved her. They referred to her as the people's Joan of Arc. She very much promoted the idea that the country was in the hands of Wall Street and the corporations, and they had left the people behind, which is a very populist thing to say. And she was probably their number one campaigner, if you will. She advocated for women's suffrage, for temperance, and for the populist platform, which we'll talk about in a second. In the 1892 campaign, she made more than 160 speeches on behalf of populist candidate for governor of Kansas, Lorenzo de Bueling, and ends up being a very vocal and important activist within the Populist Party. So the 1892 elections, the Populist Party holds its first convention in Omaha. Here's a ticket to attend the convention. Here's some party buttons. Let's see what they suggested. And I want you to keep in mind, sometimes ideas float around. They don't win the first time. This is a concept, that I've tried telling you guys about before. Radical ideas, sometimes not always, have a habit that if they're good ideas, maybe not always. Good ideas didn't always, sometimes bad ideas make it too. But if they're good ideas, sometimes they have a habit. Maybe they fail at the beginning, maybe they fail for a while. But if enough dedicated people that really believe in it keep pushing it, you'd be surprised how often they become normal and accepted. Um, the Populist Party promoted a number of ideas at this 1892 convention that at the time seemed really radical, at the time seemed really out there, because yeah, I mean they were the I guess you could say radical alternative to the Democrats or the Republicans at the time. And you'd be surprised how many of these ideas eventually come true and become successful. This one didn't, but it was super interesting. One of the things that the progressives were asking, I mean, not the populists were asking for, was for the government to create a system of sub-treasuries. What does this mean? That the government own and operate a number of storage facilities, right? Where farmers would go and be able to store grain and cereals or what have you. But it almost becomes a bank because then the farmers could take out loans against the value of what they have stored in that government warehouse, up to 80% of its value. So it's almost like the government would hand out loans to farmers at very low interest, and as collateral, okay, would underwrite these loans using whatever grain or those farmers stored in those government warehouses. Says they don't have money, but they have, what they harvest. Maybe they could use that as collateral for low interest government loans. It didn't happen, but it is a pretty interesting idea. When you think about just, money doesn't have to be dollars. Money could be a number of things as long as they have value. Abolition of the national bank. Um, they were just summarizing the discontent they had with banks altogether. Um, and the interest rates they were being charged. Direct election of senators. At the time, senators were not elected by the people. They were elected by state legislatures. And the argument is whoever paid the state legislatures the most ended up with the Senate seat. Incredibly corrupt system that was basically run by patronage. And they're suggesting a very democratic alternative. The people should have a say of who their senators are. Okay? Well, guess what? That's one of those ideas that make it. Maybe not in 1892, but it was a good idea. And give it some time, it's going to be reality. The more radical elements within the Progressive Party believed that the solution to the abuse by the railroad companies was that the government should own the railroad companies, or if not all the railroad companies, a number of transcontinental lines, as well as telephone and telegraph companies. State owned and operated and controlled, believing that that would provide better service and better and better prices, particularly for struggling farmers. Government operated postal savings banks. This is really important for folks that live in rural America. Banks were really far away, and whatever banks were available in the area usually used their position of virtual monopoly to take advantage of the farmers. So maybe the government could operate alongside the post offices located in rural America. They could also provide basic savings and loan uh, services for farmers. This actually exists throughout Europe. It doesn't exist here. It was a suggestion not that long ago, um, that perhaps the post offices could provide an additional service, particularly in rural parts of the country, which is basically banking. This is one of the mm, less admirable demands of the populace: restriction of undesirable immigration, with the idea, and this has been floating around, this nonsense doesn't go around, that it suppresses wages and it endangers jobs, et cetera, et cetera. There really was no sense to this, as far as the farmers were concerned, but unfortunately, this was springboarding off the Chinese Exclusion Act, which in the 1880s they banned Chinese from coming into the country, and they wanted to expand it even further. Um, yeah, the 8-hour workday for government employees. And this has a lot to do with them and their alliance with the Knights of Labor, that they make it becomes part of the party platform for the 8-hour day. The abolition of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, of course. Okay. They were already hated. Already they had busted up that very year. You know, look what they did in Homestead. So it becomes part of the party platform to get rid of the Pinkertons, abolish them as an organization. The Australian secret ballot. Mr. Hernandez, what in the heck is that? Up to 1892, voting in pretty much all states was a transparent thing. People saw what you did. Your party ticket was a different color to differentiate it from the other party, and ballot boxes were these glass vessels. The belief was that this is coercive. People didn't feel that they could safely vote, especially, and it was not democratic. And the Australians already adopted, I guess it was the Australians, why else call it that, the secret ballot. And so that was one of their platform demands. Guess what? That's another idea that eventually makes it. Another idea that eventually makes it. 10, we're going to need another PowerPoint to another video to describe this. The remonetization of silver, which Cleveland pulled the plug out from that very year. Okay, with the he got rid of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. I'm gonna explain to you in a future video why is it that farmers believed that expanding the money supply by including silver as well as gold, inducing inflation, they could get more money for their products, and this will put them in a better position to pay off their debts. And there's another one, single term for president and vice president. Um, that didn't quite happen, but many years later, we're going to introduce term limits for president and vice president. And of course, it's a campaign. And during campaigns, people try to convince the electorate why you shouldn't vote for the other guy. This illustration is an interesting look at some of the arguments that were made against the populist. And a lot of it was rooted in stereotypes about rural people. Um, You can see a lot of these in this image right here. It's basically the Supreme Court as it may hereafter be constituted. If the populace wins, you got one judge there drinking hard cider, and there's a sign there saying that the Supreme Court will not be in tomorrow on account of the circus being in town. Um, it's supposed to be painted as a not a serious affair. There's like a prize pumpkin. So of course, I imagine this is to convince, sophisticated urban Americans that you don't want, what they used to call ignorant hayseeds to run for office. Before I finish this up, well, not yet. Let me go to the next slide. And here's the outcome of the election of 1892. I imagine you could have guessed it. The populists don't win. Okay, he does better than any third party candidate ever. He wins 5 states, but that's the point. The rural states with very low electoral counts. Weaver won 8.5% of the popular vote in 5 states, but still fell short of victory. Despite the support of Terence Powderly, Knights of Labor, and Eugene Debs, the party failed to win over urban laborers. And when we talk about money, it makes sense. Of course, they're not going to win over the American working class because they want to raise prices. And who is that negatively going to affect? After the election of 1892, and before we move this map, it's really interesting how some of the most conservative states in the country today, not that long ago, were some of the most left-wing radical states, okay? Accused of, outright, being, how can I say it, grounds, fertile soil for socialist, communist, revolutionary fervor in politics. You had some of these states that are very conservative today. 100 and change years earlier, it was very different political arrangement. Well, after the disappointment of 1892, the party ends up splitting into between the fusionists, led by Weaver, who wanted to join the Populist Party with the growing populist wing of the Democratic Party. It's at this moment that the Democratic Party, because of internal divisions, is starting to reform and redefine itself into eventually the form and shape that we recognize today. It's starting to happen here in the 1890s. And middle of the roaders like Mary Elizabeth Lease, who wanted to keep the Populist Party independent. And lastly, I'll leave you with this image, because it would seem that after all those years of the Grange and the Farmers Alliance, and eventually going big and having a political party and doing pretty well, and then just deciding to just forget the whole thing and join the Democrats, okay, that's done. We're done. All hope is done. Well, not yet. Not yet. There's still one more story to be told. And the solution? Follow the yellow brick road. And that image is there on purpose. We'll continue this story next time.